Greetings, environmentalists, and welcome to Lecture 3. 17 more to go for this semester. So we're going to be learning about ecology and energy today, and let's just go ahead and get started. So our objectives that we're going to be learning about today involve what is an ecosystem versus a community, how are they similar, how are they the same. We're going to be discussing concepts associated with a biosphere, a new word, and we're going to look at various factors associated with ecology and trophic levels. You'll learn what trophic levels are a little later. We'll describe the origins of energy within ecosystems, and we'll assess thermodynamics. Doesn't that sound like a tough word? It's not that bad, really. And ecological pyramids. So let's give a brief introduction of ecology. Ecology is different from biology, but yet it's very similar. It's the study of interactions, not just the study of living things, but the interaction between those living organisms and the environment. So that environment may be abiotic. We learned about last time, or in biomes 1 and 2, about abiotic versus biotic. So in ecology, we're looking at those interactions, and we are seeing how they are related and how one impacts the other. This branch of science deals with the relationships of organisms and to one another and to their physical surroundings. So if their physical surroundings were to change, let's just say a tropical rainforest where this frog might be right here, and its habitat is disturbed, how does that impact the living organism? If its food resource is removed, how does that impact the organism? If climate change were to impact the type of vegetation that could grow in the area, how would that impact the frog? All of these things are part of ecology, so it's a much more in-depth science than just studying the living thing itself. So the ultimate goal of ecology is to fully comprehend how ecosystems function to make environments sustainable for humans. And humans are part of an ecosystem, and we've invaded other ecosystems, but there has to be a balance between what humans need and the environment. Ecologists examine the combined impacts of energy, nutrients, and organic materials and water on a specific environment in which they're studying. So we could go back to that rainforest where the frog was and think about all of those things and how they would impact the overall ecosystem. Since humans have modified natural ecosystems, we must strive to understand the original environment as it existed without us there to effectively restore the resources of the ecosystem and to maximize the production of that ecosystem. So we are all about, in ecology, trying to restore what we have changed. So a few factors of ecology: ecosystems, species, populations, and communities. And we're going to define each one of those. These will be guaranteed quiz and test questions, so you need to make sure you get these. An ecosystem is sometimes called a biomes. Woo, we've heard that word before, haven't we? Biomes 1 and 2. And we learned about 6 of them and their subbiomes, if you recall. An ecosystem may contain many working parts, and it's not just a may, it does contain many working parts from communities that form a unified whole where all the biological, the physical, and the chemical components of a complex interacting network of energy flow and nutrient cycling allow it to be successful and thrive. Ecosystems are delicate and they can be upset with a small imbalance. So again, the goal of studying ecosystems is to learn how they function so we can better restore what we have invaded as humans. So let's take a look at ecosystems a little closer. What's a species? You're like, what's up with the 3 dogs, right? So something's not up right with them, right? I mean, you're looking at them like, they're kind of odd looking. But they could be a certain species. of dog. These are a group of living organisms by definition that consist of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. So you may be going, okay, it looks like these dogs may have some issues. Remember that interbreeding is simply a change of or exchange of genes. While we may have a moral compass or a moral parameter around how we see the action of breeding, in nature, those are not likely shared. And so it's basically the job to be alive, find mates, and reproduce to ensure the longevity and survival of your species. So when we're looking at a species, they must be able to be capable of breeding and interbreeding. So that's one of the first definitions to accept and not put a personal opinion or religious belief on, because we're looking at an ecosystem that's non-human related. So what are populations? These are a group of organisms of the same species, not different ones, that live in the same area at the same time. Species within a boundary. So here you got these cattle. That would be a great example. I'm going to use students at this college as an example as well. So if you're taking environmental science, doesn't matter whether you're in a face-to-face or an online class, you are in a population of students at MCC. More specifically, you are a population within environmental science, the section that you've enrolled in. So we would all be the same organisms living in the same area at the same time, especially if you're looking at a face-to-face class in a classroom setting. That would be a really good analogy. Communities, how do they differ from populations and species? These are a natural association that consist of all the populations of different species that live and interact within an area at the same time. So now we're getting into the big picture stuff, seeing how they interrelate. Ecological communities can be extremely small, such as a log or a pond. We got a little log here. I bet you if you sat there and watched it for about an hour, you would see it's just gleaming with life, and not just one type of life. And that's the point of studying communities. Then we can look at very large communities like a region or a biome. For example, we could look at the savanna. We could look at maybe a specific type of desert like a coastal desert, or we could look at the tundra, and we can begin to see what's happening in these specific larger biome areas in terms of ecological communities. Why in the heck do we care? Well, it's on your test for starters, but it really matters in terms of the environmental scope that you're supposed to leave with from this class. You can apply ecology to pretty much every aspect of your own personal life. We'll use the college again as an example. It's the ecosystem, the entire college, the species or the students, the population is going to be the individual classrooms, and then we have the community that makes up the entire process. So when you start to see how this all fits, you can start to say, okay, it works in my job, it works in my home, it works with my friends, it works with whatever you may be examining, and you can start to see that ecosystems have personalities. They begin to resonate that as we start to dive deeper and examine closer what attributes make up that community. When we think about landscape ecology, this is an ecological subdiscipline that studies ecological processes over large areas. This study often involves seeing how various ecosystems respond to one another. So we're looking at the interactions between the landscape and the ecosystem and the organisms that live there. It's a balance. For example, a river, a stream. If you get pollution in the stream, how does that impact the water quality? How does the water quality impact erosion? How does the water quality impact the living organisms such as fish, plants, or aquatic plants, macroinvertebrates, which are bugs that live in rivers? How does that all relate to one another? And how is that one factor, let's say you change and get a high amount of phosphorus and you get a real acidic water body, does that do something that causes an interaction to the landscape? And certainly the answer would be yes, it does. And so we would want to figure out how could we resolve that. So let's define biosphere. All of you know the word bio already from biomes. That's living things. A sphere refers to parts of different things on Earth or parts of any kind of planetary structure. So let's take a look at this. We know that we have an atmosphere. You guys are familiar with that. We have an ocean. We have land, surface, and soil that all contain living things. So we have living things in every one of those places. The part of the Earth where living things exist is the biosphere by definition. This encompasses all the ecosystems on Earth, so it's kind of like the giant umbrella that everything about ecosystems falls underneath. So, quote unquote, this is going to be where the stuff is living. So remember that a biosphere is more than just the atmosphere. It's more than just the hydrosphere, which would be the water cycle and water on Earth. And the lithosphere is rock and ground. It's all of those things put together. So there's an interaction between how those things work. And we can prove that geologically with fossils. So it's not just with the things that we currently have. We've also been able to go back in time and scroll the clock back geologically to discover that this reaction's been going on since living things began to inhabit the planet. When we think about the biosphere, so much of what the biosphere includes is actually in the ocean, and you think about the various different places, lithosphere being land, the cryosphere being, cryo stands for ice, by the way, and the atmosphere. We need to know a little bit more about each part of the biosphere. So we're going to be looking at that. Let's talk about factors that affect the biosphere. The first one would be the atmosphere. That's no shock, right? This is the gaseous envelope that surrounds a planet or moon. And quote unquote, that's going to be where there is air. But I challenge that to say it's more than that. We didn't just magically get an atmosphere. It grew because of several factors. We talked about how comets and meteors help bring some of the components of water to Earth. We've talked about outgassing from volcanoes already, and we will be talking about that more. And I also mentioned stromatolites when we were talking about that in biomes. So I hope you look them up because they're super cool. And I actually put a picture of them in your lecture for you to see. So the atmosphere evolved during the Precambrian eon, and it's been very sustainable for living conditions with the type of atmosphere we have today for millions of years. But let me caution you that it's subject to change. And it has with climate warmings and climate coolings throughout geologic history. So understand that the atmosphere is a really big deal about biospheres. So the second factor of a biosphere is the hydrosphere, hydro referring to water. So these are the areas of the Earth that contain major water resources such as groundwater, which is underground water, water vapor, that's a big one because that helps address the water cycle in terms of cloud formation, oceans, seas, lakes, which would be lacustrine, kind of getting back to your biomes terms, rivers, another biome term, fluvial, any other source of water that we might have on Earth. Often we link it just to Earth, but we know that water has and in some form still exists on celestial planets beyond water. So wherever there is water, that's what we're referring to as the hydrosphere. Earth just happens to have a lot of it, which makes it one of the most interesting planets in our solar system and galaxy. The lithosphere. This is my realm as a geologist. Litho refers to rock and layers of rock. So when we're talking about lithosphere, we're talking about the ground. It's the soil and rock of the Earth's crust, and it's a planet or a moon's outer solid crust. Quote unquote, it's rocks and dirt. Now, rocks are awesome, folks, so if you don't know much about rocks, come take geology because I'm going to open a world to you that just defines and reshapes your view and lens of rocks because they tell us so much about the Earth's history, and some of them are actually worth a lot of money. Really fun stuff to learn about. Another factor of a biosphere is the cryosphere, and this is the ice. Jupiter's moon, Europa, is a case in point because it kind of like has an ice cover around the whole thing. There's something underneath it, which is the mystery and the excitement of learning more about Europa. But nevertheless, we're not the only place that has ice, obviously, on planet Earth. Understanding that, the cryosphere is important because as it changes, let's say here on Earth, that impacts ecosystems throughout the entire world. So let's say we have an ice age or global cooling. That's going to change the land, what kind of resources food-wise is available. Same thing when we start to melt the ice, because as we melt the ice, that changes ocean circulation, changes the amount of water vapor that's in the atmosphere. So this is a direct correlation to what happens with the cryosphere of a planet to the capabilities of life being able to survive. So as we know that it's ice, and it can be ice on Earth and other celestial bodies, this is where we got ice, icebergs, and glaciers. So don't just think about glaciers as just the pretty ones that are in Alaska and in the mountains. We're also thinking about the large continental glaciers that make up Greenland, that make up Antarctica. And in the past, as recently as about 20,000 years ago, we had major ice that was all the way down into the United States, not to Texas, not to Oklahoma, but as far south as northern Kansas. And so we need to realize that continental glaciers have invaded the United States throughout geologic time. So wrapping up biospheres, there are many other celestial bodies throughout our solar system and galaxy, and the universe for that matter, that have atmospheres, cryospheres, hydrospheres, and lithospheres, and they have an interaction. The Earth is the only known one of these at this time, and I emphasize at this time, that supports a biosphere. So the biosphere is kind of a big deal because that's where the living organisms are. If we find somewhere else that supports a biosphere, we got some cool stuff going on. So let's talk about energy and how it affects an ecosystem. This is from the Greek word energos, which means active or at work, and it's the capacity to do work or produce change. Energy exists in different forms, but neither created nor destroyed, so it's always there. It's just simply converts to another form, and I'm going to try to give you an example of that. If you've ever stuck an ice tray, back in the days where we didn't have automatic ice makers, we only had ice trays. So I can remember when I was a little kid, we had a pink freezer, no joke, a pink freezer. Really pink? Yes, and it was pink, and that was common back then. And we had these ice trays, and I was always fascinated. I'd put the ice trays in there, and the scientist in me just had to see what happened if you put different things in them, or different materials, or how long you left them in, what happened to the ice cubes. I know that sounds really corny, but hey, I'm a geek, I'm a scientist. So I noticed that after a long period of time, some of the trays lost all their ice, but we didn't use it. So that would be an example of sublimation. And what happens when you change from one form of another in the water cycle, you actually either gain or lose energy in the form of calories. So it's kind of like your diet. And so as we interchange these energy forms, they can be measured in a form of energy. At the end of the semester, we'll look at a specific type of form of energy called watts per square meter. And that's how we measure the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. That'll be super important to climate. Not right now. So potential energy is that energy that's not used or stored. So it's potential. It's there and available to use, but it's not being stored and it's not being actively tapped into. Kinetic, however, this type of energy is energy in motion that is being used. So you look at the potential, you got this guy setting up to do a Katniss Everdeen move, and then you get the actual Katniss Everdeen move and the kinetic over here on the right. So with that understanding, kinetic is always going to be releasing energy and using energy. And potential does neither. It's just kind of stationary. It's a better way to think about it. Potential energy, in simple term, is energy that is stored at rest. It's not being used. You can almost think about it as calories in your body stored as fat. When energy is used, it becomes kinetic energy. So that's one reason there's a study called kinesiology. I actually went into that field when I initially started college and have a degree in that area. So I can tell you that it's a very interesting process because moving bodies burn more calories, they burn more energy. And potential energy is just being stored there and not being used. So potential energy comes in many forms depending on the type of energy being involved. So let's take a look a little different at kinetic energy. In simple terms, it's the energy that's happening in motion or of motion. There are many types of kinetic energy and that cannot be determined with negative numbers. That means you cannot give it back once you use it. It's been expended, it's energy that's been used, but it's deposited back, I guess a good way to say. You can just think of ways that you deposit what you eat, where it comes out, so it gets back into the ecosystem that way. So you see your kinetic energy in, the potential energy at the top of the hill, and then energy out as it's coming out the back end as they're rolling down the hill. So a brief overview of energy and matter, and then let's talk about why we even care. Everything requires energy to exist or have a come to be in existence or into being. So without energy, living things won't exist, so we won't have a biosphere. That's why it's so important. Most things also require mass to exist, but all mass was placed in its location or is currently moving because of its interaction with energy. So the study of physics is really all about the way to capture energy and use it and understand energy, and that matters when we're talking about ecosystems and specifically biospheres. In an isolated system, energy can change its location throughout a system but cannot be destroyed. In addition, once your energy is used, it defaults back to being potential energy until it's acted upon by another force, thus making it kinetic energy once again. All of our energy comes from one place and only one place. So let's take a look at that location. Thank you to the sun. Good news, bad news. We got quite a few billions of years before our sun decides to become a red giant and engulf all of the inner terrestrial planets. So about 2.5 billion years. So that's good news. Bad news is it's going to happen one day, and our sun will not be able to support living organisms the way it does today on planet Earth. So thermodynamics is the study of energy and how it transforms, and often it's part of a quote-unquote system of its surroundings. There's two systems, open and closed. That's pretty easy, right? An open system is where energy is exchanged between an open system and its surroundings. So we're going to take a look at the difference between open and closed. You can see it in the diagram on your screen. A closed system is energy is not exchanged, in other words, between an open system and its surroundings. So which one of these do you think would be open and closed when you look at this system? And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So another example, where's the open one here? And I'm pretty sure you're looking at the one that doesn't have a cap on it. And you're going, yeah, it's the coffee cup there. So we got two coffee cups, right? And then we got a closed system on the left with a thermos. And so the energy is being held captive, kind of. And so open and closed each have a purpose. So let's look at them. When we're thinking about the law of thermodynamics, we need to learn about the first and second law and understand how this applies to biospheres. The first law is an organism cannot create energy. It merely captures it from its surroundings. As far as we know, the energy present when the universe formed somewhere between 15 to 20 billion years ago is still present today, and it equals the amount that was present back then. No more will be created unless, of course, we have another Big Bang, which equates to something like a supernova, if you want to look up what a supernova is, about a star. The second law is as energy transformation occurs, some energy is exchanged and lost to heat that is released into cooler surroundings. But I thought I said that we didn't lose or gain heat. Remember, we're not losing it from our biosphere. It's still staying there, but it may not be with that person, that animal, that plant. It can be re-given back to the biosphere. No other organism can ever reuse energy for biological work. It becomes lost. So that's the second law of thermodynamics. Think of it like your paycheck. You obtain your funds from somewhere, but cannot make your own money. If you are, we need to talk, right? So you literally can't print your own money. I guess you could argue that with Bitcoins right now, but Bitcoins are just imaginary virtual money. Probably somewhere in the future, we won't even have real money as we know it today in terms of coins and dollar bills. Once you spend your money, it's adiosio, it's gone. Isn't that a bummer? I thought money should grow on trees, right? But I haven't seen that in nature yet. I'd like to find the money tree, but so if you find it, please let me know where it is. Some is constantly lost to taxes and to fees. So I hate that on my paycheck when I look at it and I see how much goes to income tax and other things that I never see, right? It just goes poof, it's gone. So I look forward to my paydays because I get most of my check minus the taxes and fees. So that's kind of how your first and second law of thermodynamics work. The sun produces the light energy that we have in Earth, and the amount of sun that we receive, or sunlight energy, is important to the climate budget that we'll talk about in the last two lectures of this semester. So as the sunlight produces energy, which is then captured by plants via photosynthesis and converted into chemical energy. Well, last I checked, most of us eat some form of plants or fruits, so that means we would be consuming that energy, right? This chemical energy is stored in the form of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and sugars. Plants are called autotrophs because they can produce their own food, lucky them, from nutrients and sunlights. So if you are able to produce your own foods, that means you're going to be at the bottom of the food chain, but that's pretty awesome that you can do that. I mean, even though you're at the bottom of the food chain in terms of being able to be everybody else's food, you still make your own food. Pretty awesome thing. So consumers then will obtain their energy by consuming autotrophs. Shocker, right? Hence, that's why they are called consumers. Consumers are called heterotrophs. These are terms you're going to need to know for your quiz and test. There are different types of consumers, three to be exact. They're primary, secondary, and tertiary. So let's look at each of those types of consumers. Primary consumers are those that eat producers, and they are called grazers. So you can imagine that would be like your antelopes, it would be like your cows, your horses, your sheep. We have a donkey that lives next to us, and it's really interesting. And so the donkey, we call her Sally, that's her name actually. And Sally eats anything you give her, like carrots, but she grazes all the time. So she would be a primary consumer. Secondary consumers are those that eat primary consumers. They're called predators. And tertiary consumers eat primary and secondary consumers. They are also called predators. So just because lions having an old feasty over here doesn't mean that they won't eat any kind of producer as well. For example, grizzly bears eat berries and insects. They also eat warm-blooded mammals, so they would be a tertiary consumer. Well, unfortunately, everybody dies, and they are consumed by decomposers. So just when you thought we were done with all of the consumers, you got to think about what happens after they're done. So decomposers play a part in a role in life in the cycle of the biosphere. So in nature, without the sun, the autotrophs, which are our plants here, can't even exist if there's no sun. So without the autotrophs, we don't have primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers. And so if the plant life dies, belly up for everybody else because it's a closely knitted, interrelated process of living on Earth. And then you get the decomposers that actually finish the job after everybody's done. Everything eats something else. Decomposers eat producers, consumers, and even other decomposers. Scientists often use what's called food chains and more complex food webs to study how all of these species interact, and it can be very complex. So food webs are a much more detailed look at the interactions of organisms so we can understand if there's a failure point somewhere in that ecosystem, then we understand how to help address to remedy it, especially if we're the cause of the problem. Food chain versus food web. The food chain shows how living things obtain their food and generally has 4 to 5 links. Works well for small little niches. However, when you look at how it demonstrates a particular species and how it obtains food, how is that different from a food web? This shows how living things obtain their food, so it's similar to a food chain in that reference. Extremely complex diagram with literally up to hundreds of links. That'd be a great test question. May contain several hundred species, so it's not good for a small niche. So there's a purpose for a food chain and a food web. You just kind of have to know the difference between each as an ecologist and apply it to the right situation. So when you're looking at the web that you see here, the food web, it all links back to that sun, which allowed the plants on Earth to photosynthesize and create the energy source that's consumed by primary consumers. And then we have secondary consumers, not shown here, are tertiary consumers, and then the decomposers that finish off the job and put the energy back into the environment. So which was this previous slide an example of? The previous slide was a food web, right? This is going to be a food chain. Understand there's a difference. When you're looking at energy availability in ecological pyramids, the energy availability is often measured and determined by using what's called an ecological pyramid, similar to what we saw in biomes, but with a different view. Ecological pyramids trace how energy dissipates between links in the food chains and webs, and there are 3 specific types of ecological pyramids: numbers, biomass, and then energy. Let's take a closer look. The pyramid of numbers indicates the amount of organisms at each trophic level in a given ecosystem, with greater numbers illustrated by a larger area for that section of the pyramid. So look down here, you should have a higher number of your autotrophs, which are your producers, than you would be of your tertiary consumers. This can be inverted with higher numbers at the top, like if thousands of leaf-eating insects live on one tree. The problem is that this does not factor in biomass or energy transferred from one species to another. So there's a little problem with just looking at one lens of the pyramid. So let's look at the second pyramid, which is the pyramid of biomass. This is a numeric estimate of the total mass / amount of living material, indicating the amount of energy available at one particular time in an ecosystem, such as what you see on the left here. And you can see the biomass is done in grams per squared meter, and then you can see that it's much higher down here with producers, lower as you go up to the more complex parts of the food chain, meaning tertiary consumers. This pyramid can also be inverted when combination of consumers outweigh producers. That's bad news, especially for the consumers when they need those producers to help with availability of food resources. Again, an ecological imbalance. For example, do you eat 2 small apples or 1 large one? Or how many consumers split resources if the meal is too large? So when we're thinking about that, the pyramid of biomass matters. But there's still a third pyramid. Let's take a peek. This is a graphical model of the pyramid of energy that is shaped like a pyramid to show how the energy flows through a food web or a food chain. The amount of energy decreases and becomes less available for organisms as it enters each trophic level. For example, not as much available as you're getting into the tertiary consumer. Remember thermodynamics. Since energy is always lost at trophic levels, energy pyramids always point upright. So you can see that this one has a lot more energy down here at the producer level, much less energy at the trophic level. Here's that kcal. So remember, we're talking about kinetic calories and things of that nature. So where does energy originate? By now you should know it's the sun. Go sun, right? So the sun is our source of energy, solar radiation. Can ecosystems be fully restored? That is a tough question, but one that we will be looking more in depth when we get into our endangered species, our lectures. What are the 2 examples of resources that ecosystems require from an abiotic environment? Can you remember what those 2 are? Or 2 examples? Will it ever be possible to have an inverted pyramid of energy? Why or why not? You need to be able to answer those questions for your quizzes and tests. So think about those questions and ponder them and put an intellectual answer based on what you've learned today. Science servings. We love science servings, right? That means we're close to the end of the lecture. It is believed that leopards are the highest populated cat in Africa. I love leopards. They're awesome. Habitat loss represents the greatest contributing factor to any extinction, and that's not just in modern day time. Extinctions in geologic past has been true as well. Technically, detritus has its own food chain system. The good news is that you do not have to know that for Environmental Science 1. Yay! So that's good news. So as we close and wrap it up for lecture number 3, remember survival. The less you stand out, the longer you'll last. Think about that for this animal on that tree. How does that relate to our discussions today? As you get ready to watch lecture number 4, I'll see you back then. Enjoy your break, and thanks for watching lecture number 3. Bye.